Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th annual Lay James Gibson WRSA opening session. I'm Dave Plain. I'm going to moderate today's panel discussion. I'm also going to fill in for Lay Gibson, who we had hoped to call on here to give us a little historical perspective about this opening session. Lay, unfortunately, has been undergoing some medical procedures and is actually in the hospital, as far as we know at the moment. And so will not be able to join us. Hopefully he will be with us next year in Scottsdale at the 11th annual Lay James Gibson opening session. This is a session that predates my involvement with WRSA. I don't know when Lay invented it. I think it was during his time. It might have been during Bob Monahan's time in the first 10 years of the WRSA, 60 some years ago now. The idea was to have a kind of a, well, I can say it since I'm part of the operation this year, a lightweight session with some people from the local region to talk about something of interest to regional scientists about the place where we're meeting. Well, this year, where we're meeting is nowhere and everywhere. And it would be rather a large panel if we had everyone talk about where this meeting is being held. In the meantime, so Jay-Wan was a little concerned about what to do about the opening session to maintain this tradition, particularly given that there was the 10th anniversary Lay James Gibson opening session about the region and the regional science of the region where we're meeting. And in the meantime, I had talked to Mark Perry about having some kind of session about the 2020 US Census. We had thought that if things had gone according to plan, we'd have the first census results to talk about. And we were not planning that necessarily as a Lay James Gibson opening session. We were just wanting to do a session about the US Census. Well, as it did with a lot of things, the pandemic intervened. And the Census Bureau was working hard. Every time I talk to Mark, they're doing new things to try to get the 2020 census results out. So anyway, sort of like President Obama with the previous Recovery Act, looking for shovel-ready projects to spend money on, Jay-Wan said, well, Dave, let's do your session as the opening session. And I said, well, okay. Well, COVID is kind of a theme of this year's conference in any case. So we expanded the concept of the session a bit to look at demographic and demographic economic aspects of the pandemic. And I think sort of central to census taking, if you think of census taking as kind of an aspect of the pandemic, is the whole issue of residency. A lot of us have been rethinking our residences as a result of the COVID pandemic. A lot of us have been spending more time in our residences, and other people have been hanging out in places that are not their normal residences. That implies some challenges for the people taking the censuses, but it's also a fundamental change in how people are living their daily lives. And so those are some of the things we want to talk about. The other thing I want to say just before we get going is that there are many people probably attending this session that are at least as knowledgeable as those of us involved on the panel. And we don't want to hog all the time. We were thinking that to have the second half of the session be kind of a brainstorming part of the session. So in the sort of the WRSA personal tradition, I really favor the raise your hand and get called on and show your face and talk out loud format rather than the Q&A box thing. So don't put your questions or comments in the Q&A box. Rather get in line, raise your hand, and chip in to a great discussion. And our panel will try to get some issues out on the table for us. So this is very much a North American session. Let me share my screen now and talk a little bit about the panelists. This is very much a North American session because we have overrepresented Canadians here. So two of the five panelists are from Canada. We have Bruce Newbold and Mark Brown, and we have also Peter Rogerson and Nick Nagle from the US. along with Mark Perry, who, as I mentioned, was my partner in crime in putting together the session to start with. So we're going to start with Mark talking about the US Census. A little bit later, we'll be hearing from Mark Brown, who maybe can say a little bit about planning for the May 2021 Canadian Census, but Mark's also someone that has done a lot of work on economic demographic kinds of things. And so it's fair game for the panelists to talk about whatever they want to talk about in this general range of things, which is much of regional science, in fact. So without further ado, let's go to Mark Perry and hear some things from the US Census perspective.
Thanks so much, Dave. J1, if you could load the slide deck and just go to the first slide, that'd be great. And while he's getting that set up, again, my name is Mark Perry. I'm a senior demographer in the population division at the Census Bureau. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk about some of the challenges that COVID-19 sort of introduced to the 2020 census. Per Dave's suggestion, I really only have a handful of slides, and I'm just going to be kind of throwing out some issues, and then hopefully at the end we will have time to sort of talk about it in a little bit more depth. So without further ado, slide 2, please. So even without a pandemic, this is going to be a challenging census. It's sort of hard to remember now, back in now that we're in February of 2021, but back in 2020, there was a significant hurricane season, a number of hurricanes happening during our peak field operations. There were wildfires in California, Oregon, and Washington that led to air quality issues and disrupted enumeration. There was obviously significant civil unrest across the country last year, especially in May and June, but went beyond that. There were numerous legal challenges to the census. Would there be a citizenship question, for instance? When would the data collection for the census end? Would it end in late September? Would it go into mid or late October? I could speak for hours on the legal challenges for the 2020 census alone. And honestly, it felt like every few months, the US Supreme Court was deciding on some important aspect related to the 2020 census. And of course, there was general concern about the public's willingness to respond to the census. And then on top of everything else, yes, there was a pandemic. So next slide, please. So nearly every 2020 census operation that was occurring on or after March of last year was impacted by the pandemic somehow. So these are just a few of the examples. And I'll sort of go through the activity operation and then kind of the impact. So we start with the self-response phase of the census, which was originally supposed to be from March 12th through July 31st. It got extended ultimately through October 15th. The group quarters operation, and group quarters is what we call the non-household population. So in other words, people living in college dorms, prisons, nursing homes, military bases, et cetera. That operation was supposed to go from April 2nd to June 5. It was extended to September. The service-based enumeration, that's an operation for enumerating people experiencing homelessness. So it's via soup kitchens, shelters, mobile food van stops. This operation was shifted from March 30 to April 1 to September 22 to 24. And finally, and most importantly, the non-response follow-up operation. So this is where the Census Bureau sends enumerators out to visit all of those households that didn't respond to the census. And that is roughly 1/3 of the population. So originally this operation, which is the largest and the most costly part of the census, would have taken place through the end of July. and instead it occurred from August 9th through October 15th. So it's a totally different time of year. Next slide, please. So we saw on that last slide that the pandemic changed the timetable for when some operations occurred. This is important because even in a non-pandemic year, the spatial distribution of the US population obviously changes from season to season. There are regional shifts in the seasonal population, people moving from New York to Florida or from Minnesota to Arizona, for instance. There are local movements of the population that aren't quite regional, but are more local based. So places that have winter recreation, places with summer recreation. So given that, the changes in when the census, when the population was counted will lead to changes in where the population is counted. Secondly, we know that the pandemic itself impacted where people were living in 2020. So you heard all these stories already, people in cities that relocated to their seasonal homes. We heard stories about New Yorkers leaving the city and moving to upstate New York or to the Hamptons or other parts of Long Island. College students, young adults moving back in with their parents. Regional migration was impacted too. Some snowbirds never left Florida or Arizona for their homes in the Northeast or Midwest. Some others never arrived. And one result is a possible disconnect between our standard benchmark data for an April 1 population and the decennial counts. So the pandemic had many other impacts on the census, really too many to get into in a lot of detail. But if you think about the longer data collection period, one obvious impact would be recall bias. The further you get away from the April 1 reference date for the census, the more difficult it is for respondents to even remember who was living at the address on April 1. And then secondly, there's also the increased likelihood of erroneous duplication. The longer that time period is where you have more and more people moving around, it just makes it more and more difficult to try to nail down where everyone was on April 1. So next slide, please. Another impact of the pandemic is that it's now February 22nd, 2021, and we haven't yet released any results from the census, which we were supposed to do by December 31st. So the apportionment release, which is basically just, the state population totals for the 50 states, Washington, DC, and Puerto Rico, are planned for release by the end of April. And while plans can always change, I think it's looking pretty likely that that deadline is going to be met. And next slide, please. The redistricting file, it's also known as PL 94-171. That's going to be the second product release from the 2020 census after apportionment. This is the first file that includes some demographic and housing characteristics. It includes detailed geography going all the way down to the block level. The goal for this file is to be released by the end of September. And again, a lot can happen between now and September. We're still very much in the throes of all of the data processing. But I think there is general consensus within the Census Bureau that we're going to try very hard to make that September deadline. Next slide, please. And finally, since it felt weird to not have any population figures in a presentation after the census, I'm going to end with that middle number here of 332.6 million. So every decade, a team of statisticians at the Census Bureau uses current and historical vital statistics records and other data to come up with an independent estimate of what they think the size of the US population is on April 1 of the census year. This is a team that has no involvement in the decennial census. They work completely independently. They're sort of deliberately housed in a different part of the building from the people that work on the census. And so this demographic analysis estimate of the population is released ahead of the census. These three figures, and in particular the middle figure of 332.6 million, represent our best estimate of what the final count for the US should be. So stay tuned for the first results of the census just a few weeks from now, hopefully by the end of April. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So our next panelist is going to be Bruce Newbold. And I particularly asked Bruce Newbold because I had seen a blog post of his in which he speculated about some different demographic effects of the pandemic in a kind of an interesting way. But I don't know what Bruce is going to talk about here, but take it away, Bruce.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks for organizing today's session. What I'd like to talk about is sort of reserve my comments around some of the demographic impacts associated with COVID-19. I'm going to draw on some Canadian examples, but also some data from the US. So first, and I'm going to look at various spatial scales. So first, in terms of immigration, and what we're looking at here is the type of immigrants. So the blue bars represent the economic immigrants to Canada. The orange ones represent family members, and then the gray ones here represent refugee and protected persons, so humanitarian arrivals, quarter one of 2019 through quarter four of 2020. Highlighting there the second quarter of 2020, and you can see that year over year, the number of immigrants, regardless of arrival class, declined substantially. Certainly for the economic immigrants, there's a continued decline through the fourth quarter of 2020. Overall, immigration into Canada was down by 46% between 2020 and 2019. So it was a pretty significant impact on immigration, and particularly when Canada, an aging society, of course, we're looking to immigration to drive both population growth as well as labor force growth and economic activity. And a lot of that drop here, of course, hardening of the borders, it making it increasingly hard to travel because of travel restrictions. For a short while, visa offices were closed, so we just weren't processing visas earlier on in the pandemic. There's a hope that we'll see a rebound in terms of immigration this year, and the government has actually raised the quota, the number of immigrants that they want to attract for 2021 to over 400,000 new arrivals. But right now, that's looking pretty hard that we'll actually get to that or fulfill that quota because it's traveling into Canada has become increasingly hard. So international arrivals now have to quarantine in government-approved hotels. They have to have PCR tests before arriving as well as after arrival, quarantine for 2 weeks. So it's harder. We see sort of similar effects in terms of these are our temporary arrivals. In this case, the orange part of the bar represents higher skilled workers, and the blue represent lower skilled workers. And so just seeing where, April 2020, year over year, again, a substantial drop in terms of the number of temporary workers. And a lot of these coming in April would be agricultural workers, for example. So there are the lower skilled workers here. They're coming into Canada with a permit for temporary work, oftentimes in the service industry and particularly agricultural workers. So back in March and April, farms across the country were really scrambling in order to meet their needs and get their workers sort of in the country, go through the quarantine period, and be able to work. But certainly a lower number, again, year over year. Changing scale a little bit, I'm still waiting for the fourth quarter results, but inter-provincial migration from 2018 to the third quarter of 2020. There's the second quarter of 2020. In comparison to the previous year, the quarter two of 2019, number of interprovincial migrants down only about 5,000 or so migrants, it's estimated. Third quarter dropped another 17,000 year over year. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of a lag here. I'm also really curious about the directionality. You know, which provinces are receiving migrant arrivals, which ones are sending them? Because I think there's a lot that's built into the labor force here and labor force needs, and Mark might comment a little bit more, sort of more on the economic piece here. But I think a lot of what's driving these changes are, you know, as the economy sort of slowed down or shut down in certain circumstances, people returning home. Certainly a lot of discussion, the same as what's happened in the US, movement out of big cities. You know, if you have to telework, you can do that from anywhere as long as your internet connection is good. So we've saw movement out of the big cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, for example, and into the smaller outlying cities or vacation homes, rural areas. The province of Nova Scotia has actually created a program to try to draw teleworkers or remote workers into the province as part of their response to the pandemic. So I'm really curious as to what the response is. Part of the movement too, we think, is related, you know, the need for space. So households now, everybody's working at home, including children, but in a small space. That's driving that movement out of downtown cores and condos into more suburban or lower density areas. Greater fear associated with sort of exposure in congested areas, congested cores, driving that movement out as well. But I think, you know, and I'm going to end the presentation in a few minutes just talking about some of the questions. And I think, you know, there's a lot of speculation as to what's happening and what's driving these migration flows and mobility. You know, I think there's a lot of detail and a lot of understanding that we still need to put into this, a lot of thinking around what is actually happening, what's actually driving, what are the decisions behind these moves? Is it what we expect, or is it something else? Smaller spatial scales, sort of local type of mobilities. Again, you know, as I mentioned, movement out of cities to small towns and rural areas. Here, just drawing on some evidence from the United States Postal Service, and they reported that temporary moves of 6 months or less were up 27% between February and July of 2020 compared to the previous years. And it's the big cities, Canada, the US, that have experienced really, or what appears to be the largest net out-migration, while smaller towns and cities saw net in-migration. Again, probably it's that ability to work remotely, to have that greater space, maybe amenity-driven as well, that's driving some of that. The other piece here too is that there's, you know, an increase in the number of evictions, or at least the potential for evictions. And so obviously if people are being evicted, you know, they're being forced to relocate. So higher evictions, higher arrears rate, higher year-over-year vacancy rates in the large cities. And that's coming from a variety of different sources. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, in the US Evictions Lab and Pew Research have published work on some of this. So Pew, for example, you know, 3% of Americans, 9% of young Americans moving either permanently or temporarily due to the pandemic. You know, most moved to the home of a family member, but a lot of people relocating to a vacation or second home, others to a new home, 7% moving in with a friend, and 7% temporary accommodations. And there's a racialized impact here. So interestingly, Asians were more likely to have relocated based upon that Pew Research work, compared to whites who were least likely to have relocated. Blacks, Hispanics, you know, about 4 or 6%. If you heard some of the, or one of the presentations at the TRSA session earlier today, certainly seeing that racialized impact in terms of mobility. That was a daily mobility piece that was being presented, but a racialized impact for sure. So questions and needs, and this is sort of looking ahead to, you know, what do we need to ask? Part of this is going to come from census information. The Canadian census, for example, asks 1 year, where did you live 1 year ago? So that might shed some insight into relocations over this past year. We also ask 5 years ago. So there might be some comparability or ability to sort of tease out some of the COVID impacts. But, you know, at each of these different geographic scales, what's the long-term impact of the pandemic on international migration? Does it shift directions? Does it increase the flows? Does it change the rationale? And does it change public opinion around immigration? And you know, I'll just do a call out for my own paper tomorrow, and I explore some of the public opinions around immigration in the Canadian context because of COVID. Are we seeing counter-urbanization 2.0, or maybe it's even 3.0? You know, has the pandemic started or enhanced a new cycle of counter-urbanization? Again, with that movement out of big cities and into small towns, rural areas. How sustained is the impact on mobility, and what are the reasons? It's you know, we have these ideas. What are the reasons behind the mobility that we're seeing? What are the economic and demographic impacts of these changes in mobility, the changes in the population distribution on cities and people? You know, maybe the pandemic is just reinforcing existing mobility trends that we've been seeing sort of evolve or percolate over the past few years, and this has brought it to the forefront, sped up some of this, and maybe that's speeding up part of that exodus from big cities, maybe not. And then I think finally, you know, an important piece of this is that we need data from a variety of different sources that is going to take a look at the differential impacts of race, of gender, of immigration status, and the timing and motivations for movement. I think if we want to get a really good grasp in terms of what COVID-19 is doing in terms of our mobility at all these different spatial scales, we need to seriously be looking at some of these, you know, the correlates of mobility. So I'll leave it at that and pass it along. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bruce. So next up, we have Pete Rogerson. I thought of Peter for this session because he's had a long-term interest and has done work in both demographics and public health. And I know he's been following sort of the diffusion process of the pandemic in some detail. So I don't know what Peter's going to talk about either, but you're up next, Pete.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Share my screen if I can. And beginning. Okay, so yeah, thanks again, Dave. And I'd like to talk about some demographic and geographic perspectives in the 10 minutes that I have, and I'll try to whip through a few slides in that time. I want to start off with a couple maps of the US by county, looking at COVID-19 mortality. We're all used to seeing maps usually with 100,000, you know, per 100,000 population in the denominator, but of course this doesn't control at all for age. So I wanted to look at that to start out. And a simple way to do that a little bit is to look at the percent of all-cause mortality that's due to COVID-19. That at least looks at COVID compared to deaths instead of COVID just per 100,000 population. So this is the map you see. That the red is the high area, of course, and this is in the Midwest primarily, in New York and Boston. The blue areas range from about 1% to 10%, and these you see primarily along the coast, a little bit inland in the Carolinas. The red areas, if you can see there, they range from about 10 on up to as much as 40% in some of the small Midwestern counties. I did then look at a standardized mortality ratio by looking at using the indirect method of standardization, where you look at the national age-specific COVID rates along with the age structure of each county. And so this gives you a standardized mortality ratio. 100 and above is a higher, more COVID deaths than you would expect, given the age structure of the population. Blue, you have ratios less than 100 and fewer observed deaths than you would expect, given their age structure. And these two maps look broadly similar. Again, you see a lot of dark red in the Midwest, but also a lot of dark blue because of the small population sizes. The standardized mortality ratio can either be very high or very low there because of small populations. So another map that's interesting to look at, last in the sequence of 3 here, is the p-value map. How unusual is the number of COVID deaths given the population and the age structure in that county? This map's kind of interesting too, I think. Again, you see New York and Boston, and the counties that are significant in the Midwest are really quite scattered. And a lot of them just don't have the numbers. If there are fewer than 10 COVID deaths, they're not reported. So some of that scattering is due to the fact that there aren't enough deaths to report. So now this is just a table of the information over time from May on up to last week. And the N is the number of counties with more than 10 deaths. The middle column is the percentage of all deaths due to COVID. You can see that that went down for a while as treatment got a little bit better. The initial curve went down, and now it's gone back up, so that now you see about 13.7% of all deaths in the US are due to COVID. I also looked at the Hoover Index of concentration. This is essentially telling us what percentage of the deaths would have to move from county to county to equalize the distribution across the US, so that it was like the overall death distribution. And that's come down rapidly. So this basically is saying COVID mortality was concentrated relative to all-cause mortality early on, and it's come steadily down. This breaks it down by metropolitan status, and we see that small metro, micropolitan areas have a smaller percentage of their deaths due to COVID than the large central metros and fringe metros. What's interesting is just in the last couple of months, this is why I have 2 columns here, the gap between these types of places has come down quite a bit. So that the small metro, micropolitan, non-core counties are catching up with the larger areas. It's kind of a diffusion down the hierarchy, so to speak, perhaps. Focusing just for a second on non-core counties, the most rural of all counties, it was kind of interesting that a little bit of a spatial pattern emerged among that group of counties with the sort of adjacent, well, Michigan, Wisconsin, and New York had relatively low COVID deaths and a low standardized mortality ratio relative to other non-core counties, with the observed deaths being less than expected. And North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, the sort of geographically compact region in the Midwest, having a much higher percentage of all their deaths due to COVID, with a much higher standardized mortality ratio and excess deaths. This is, I also looked at the geographic center of the distribution of COVID-19 deaths. This is sort of my version of the census map, that except in 1790, and we start off in May 2020, and it's progressed steadily west and a little bit south, and the red target there in the middle is the center of all deaths for the most recent year I had data for, 2017. So it's kind of converged steadily. Well, different. It moved quite fast between July and August, and now it's slowly approached the overall death distribution. This is just a graph of Baki's standard distance, which is telling us how spread out the deaths are around that center. My Excel skills have improved, but not that much. This is May here in the beginning, June, July, August, September, and so on. Whoops, again. dot on the far right is the US value of how spread out the death distribution is in the US. And so what this is telling us is that the COVID distribution is more tightly centered around the center than is the overall death distribution. We have fewer COVID deaths on the coast and relatively more in the middle. And again, it's approached that all-cause dot, but not quite reached it yet. Now, turning to sort of impacts, I just have a little mini paragraph on births, mortality, and mobility. I've been looking at effect on births, and the one that's received the most press is this Brookings Institution report that says that there'll be 300,000 to 500,000 fewer births. Tough economic times, fertility rate usually goes down. Among states reporting their December 2020 births, the 5 states you see there, did report a change of -9%. So births were down 9% in the states that have reported so far. And that scaled up does translate into an annual change of about 380,000 or so. Mortality, I looked at some I looked at the age-specific death rates and constructed a couple of quick life tables. If the age-specific death rates prevail over a long time period, this will mean a reduction in life expectancy of about 1.25 to 1.5 years. And mobility, I kind of echo what Bruce was saying. Tight labor markets, I would expect that we might see mobility rates to decline a bit, and that's look like what some of his data were showing as well. Based on some work that Dave Plain did, migration streams might become more demographically effective. So you have more focusing on destinations rather than having just people going back and forth. You'd have it more focused in terms of the origin destination flows. I also looked at that heard about, I didn't really look at the USPS data that Bruce was mentioning, flows out of New York City. And then one or maybe 2 more quick ones here. One of the things I found out is that Zillow has downloadable data, and it's just a real treasure trove of data. And you can really look in detail at how housing prices have changed. Now, whether that's tied directly to demographic changes due to COVID is another story, but the larger metro areas have had the greatest slowdown in price increases. So if you look at how prices have changed relative to how they changed the year before, the 9 places with the greatest slowdown had an average population rank of 13. So basically the biggest places, again, echoing what Bruce was saying, the biggest places have had the biggest slowdown in the rental prices. And it was kind of interesting too, I don't have a map here of New York State, but I looked at zip codes within New York State, and of the zip codes where house prices have accelerated the most relative to the previous year, Sullivan County had 28 out of those 37 top zip codes. And Sullivan County is basically 2 counties northwest of New York City. So I think it's possible that demand has increased there as people have flown out of New York City. And then the last one is a map here of the effects of COVID on natural decrease. So if we take those 300, 400,000 fewer births, and we now add in the 500,000 extra deaths that we've just had, this map shows you in blue the places with natural decrease before COVID-19. The pink areas are additions due to the effects of mortality. And then the red areas are the effects of both mortality and the expected decline in births. So you see the spatial sort of diffusion of natural decrease due to these changes in mortality and fertility is quite spatially extensive, to say the least, I'd say. So I think I'll stop there. I think that's it. Yeah, that was just another one. So thanks, Dave, and look forward to the rest of the session.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I should note that your own family is bucking the trend in the decrease in deaths, in births rather.
Yeah, well, that too. I'm still here.
Yeah, that you're now you're now a grandfather for the first time. So.
That's true. So we've got one added down in DC there.
Yeah. Good. We move on now back up to Canada to Mark Brown. And I thought about Mark for the panel, both because he's at Stats Canada and we have the 2021 Canadian census coming up, but also Mark has really worked on the economic demographic side of things, labor force and so forth. And again, I don't know what Mark's going to talk about, but take it away, Mark. You need to unmute yourself, Mark.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I'm just trying to get the presentation up. Try this again. Screen. That looks promising.
Yeah.
And here we go. So we know all the sessions. So let me move on to the next slide here. Oops. All right, there we go. So, I'm going to approach this talk in two parts. The first part sort of deals with, how the statistical system has effectively reacted to COVID, with the big emphasis on the census. And then the second part, I sort of want to delve more into some of the socioeconomic demographic potential impacts of COVID, and sort of point towards some questions in some areas where we might want to think about doing more work. So in terms of the census, unlike the US, we're still sort of in the planning, moving into the implementation stage. So we tested the census questionnaire back in May 2019. But of course, in mid-March, the world shut down, and so did Statistics Canada, and we moved to remote work, which is where I'm actually still doing now. And because of IT limitations, really everything was limited to Stat Canada mission critical work for the first several months. But that mission critical work did include the census, so all the planning for the census kept going. And that involved things like thinking about guidelines being developed in terms of answering questions and whose responses may be affected by COVID. That hasn't been released yet, so unfortunately I can't quite speak to those. And I should also have, in terms of planning, that we're still on track for Census Day, which is May 11th, 2012. In terms of implementation, the plan is to be, as they say, contactless. And that's, we were by and large contactless already. In 2016, almost 90% of responses required no contact. They're either online electronic questionnaires or by mail. And if there is contact in terms of enumerators, we're going to be following medical protocols and what you would expect. For collective dwellings, I think in the US are called group quarters, such as retirement homes or nursing homes and the like. It's actually going to be administrators who are actually going to implement the survey, not census employees. So there's some shifting there in terms of methodology. And as I mentioned, with the electronic questionnaire, there will be instructions that will take into account COVID, especially with regards to employment, education, commuting, and expenditures. And we're still planning on dissemination, which is in progress. Dates haven't been set yet, so that's still to be announced in terms of when the various tranches will go out. And of course, there's people are considering a lot of analysis right now in terms of what the initial analysis pieces will be too. And of course, commuting and employment will be very topics I'm sure will be covered. But it's not only the census. Statistics Canada sort of covers the map, so to speak, in terms of producing statistics, and we've been sort of adjusting the statistical system to in its entirety to try to react to the needs of Canadians in terms of their data needs. This has ranged from flash estimates, so getting out estimates of manufacturing sales, which come out on a monthly basis even sooner, Adapting surveys, the Canadian Business Conditions Survey has been adapted to have things, ask questions like expectations for post-pandemic telework. Creation of new surveys, piggybacking on the labor force survey, which produces the unemployment numbers, with a series of additional surveys and survey questions. And then also, as I'll sort of delve a little bit in a moment, developing more rapid measures of the economy. We produce provincial GDP on an annual basis, so we've been faced with having to try to produce an economic activity index that is actually monthly in nature to try to give the provinces an idea of what's happening. And what I should also add is that we've been seeing this in the past, a rise in demand from cities to get more data and more timely data. So there's a lot of demand out there for information. That's obvious, of course. But the second part, moving beyond sort of how the statistical system has reacted, is about, well, where is this all going? How can we begin to think about some of these patterns we might be seeing or might expect to see? I want to set the table a little bit just by talking about some macro variables, and then sort of go in more towards sort of regional level as well. But just to set the scene, we've seen a historic 18% decline in GDP by the spring. And despite a quick rebound in the summer, we're still about 3.5% behind in terms of pre-COVID GDP levels. In terms of employment, started off before the pandemic, a little under 6%, rise into a peak of about 13.7% in May, and we're resting at around 9.4% in January. So there's been really large macro shocks. And of course, these may underlie some of these regional patterns that may emerge as well. And we also have 1.1 million workers are affected by job loss or substantial reductions in hours of work. That's at about a workforce of about 20 million or so. So these are relatively big numbers. The chart on the right is this activity index I mentioned before. It's provincial, it's monthly. I've got the September to September change here, and we have the provinces and territories on the graph. We have a couple of different methods that we can use to produce this index. The point to be drawn from the graph is just how much variability there is across the provinces. In fact, how important it is to try to figure out what's going on at the provincial level in terms of the economy. You'll note that Alberta and Saskatchewan have some of the largest declines, at least in terms of the light blue bars. And that's related to changing resource prices and its effect on the economies there and other factors as well. But we can also talk about population, which is more apropos for this session. And Bruce has already alluded to this. We've seen falling immigration levels, and this is in fact essentially halted population growth. And that, of course, has demand side implications for the housing market in large urban areas that typically attract a lot of immigration. And you can see this here on the right-hand side graph, where if you focus on Toronto, which is the first city on the x-axis, you see a decline in Toronto of 200 immigrants arriving in 2019 to 60,000 in 2020, almost a halving of it. And you see similar patterns across some of the other larger cities in Canada, with some really big effects in these cities, which may have large effects on housing markets and the like. So now, what can we begin to expect about the future? And here, I think I'm delving a little bit into some speculation, but I think I'm going to try to ground it in as much information as possible. How can we think about the supply of remote work? How much firms are actually willing to allow or permit workers to work remotely or telework in the long run? Based on this recent surveys, we found that about 35% of businesses report telework or remote working as a possibility for their workers. And about 15% of businesses actually expect employees to continue to telework or work remotely. So there is there's changes occurring, and there's expectations that it will remain, but we shall see. What about the demand for remote work? There's a couple things I can sort of point to here that might suggest there may be more demand for people to move away, potentially from cities, to take advantage of their possibility of doing this type of work. There's a positive urban-rural gradient in terms of life satisfaction. In other words, life satisfaction is higher in rural areas. And one wonders whether this creates a latent demand for rural living. And the other thing is just some work I've done with Bruce Newbold and a colleague of mine at StatsCan. We can also talk about migratory friction, and in part it stems from basically reluctance to switch firms. You sort of glean this from the fact that over half of labor market migrations in Canada are actually intra-firm. So if we're providing more flexibility for workers to detach from where they're living and working to working and living in some far away, then maybe this is indicating this friction won't get less. You can move somewhere but not actually change firms. Then we can sort of talk about what are the implications of this shifting demand and supply for telecommuting or remote work. We can talk about inter-labor market effects. Will we see a rising inter-regional migration? I don't know. There has been alluded to all along. There's been some telltale signs of shifts going on. Over shorter distance, we've seen rising prices in markets outside of large urban areas in Ontario. These are typically high, cottage country type places. Over longer distances, it's reported in the Globe and Mail recently that more Ontarians and Albertans have migrated into Nova Scotia during the first 3 quarters of last year than all of 2019. And as Bruce has mentioned, the Nova Scotia government's goal is to attract 10,000 telecommuters this year. I have Facebook ads asking me to move to Nova Scotia all the time, and from the Nova Scotia government. And in terms of intra-labor market effects, of course, the opera question here is, is there a shift out from the dense city cores to the suburbs? This is still to be seen, but we do know that through the pandemic, there's been a relative and absolute decline in condo prices in places like Toronto, but not the same decline, in fact, rising prices in terms of single-family homes, condos being more in the center of cities and single-family homes, of course, being on the outskirts. And just as a side note here, something I've been wondering and what this all means for commuting-related emissions and the relationship between economic aggregates like employment and emissions. Will we see a sort of a disconnect here, or are we just seeing people moving out of cities further away, but still commuting in the town once in a while, but over longer distances? And what does that mean on net for emissions levels? Lastly, of course, there's a whole bunch of unknowns here. I think a lot of this actually pivots on firm level productivity. Are they really in the long run as productive when their workers are working remotely? And of course, you can sort of wed this to a Marshallian sort of look at the world in terms of agglomeration economies, and you can ask whether there will be less knowledge spillovers and labor market pooling effects that are in the past have been related to productivity, very high levels of productivity. And lastly, what will be the effects on the accumulation of human capital as at the start of workers' careers and the development of firm-specific capital? If you're working remotely and you're starting in a new firm, is that as an effective way of learning the firm's culture or learning the ropes than being there? And so what does this mean in terms of worker wages in the long run? Are they going to be keeping up if they're not quite as productive? We'll see. So anyways, I don't have the answers, but those are some of the questions that I've been posing to myself. And that's it for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. I think a lot of regional scientists really at the top of the list of things that we've been thinking about, commuting and employment certainly are there. And then from there to effects on urban form and population distribution and so forth. And segueing now to our fifth and final panelist, Nick Nagle. I actually thought of Nick for this panel because he and I were both asked to serve on a little committee to advise the Office of Management and Budget and the Census Bureau that does the work of this, of delineating US metropolitan and micropolitan areas. Of course, the committee met and made its recommendations prior to COVID. But anyway, Nick always has interesting things to say, and I'm sure he will hear. So take it away, Nick.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So this is going to be a bit speculative, but the purpose of that is to emphasize, I think, some questions that we really don't know the answers to, both about COVID and about census data quality. And so, I thought I'd start with some maps of what we're being told by the census as to their self-response rate. And by all measures, it appears to be pretty darn good, middle 60%. Obviously, there's some spatial variation here, less good in rural areas, and obviously some, if you look at maps of Chicago and New York, we see some variations by race and ethnicity and class. But the question I wanted to ask, I was thinking about data quality with the census, is it possible to have a good response rate, but to have a poor count? And I think we're going to see quite a bit of this go around. I'm not sure, for example, how this has always been the case, but I think we'll have a lot more. Mark showed some of this timeline 5 talks ago. My question here is, census day was April 1st, and the non-response occurred between July and October. And a lot of the enumeration of, especially of transitory locations and other people who are kind of in various or have no housing situation didn't occur until September. And so I'm really interested in what are we missing in terms of people throughout this time period between when census day was and when we're supposed to visit them and when we may have visited them, and the fact that people may be in very different places. And so when I'm thinking about response rates and undercount, there's 3 ways in which we can miss people in the census, of course. One is if the household isn't in the sample frame. So if the house is suddenly finds themselves living in their car and not in a location known to the Census Bureau, that would be a case in which they suddenly find themselves outside of the census's sample frame. Also have unit non-response. So if a household refuses to respond to the census, and unit non-response was a big concern when we were talking about the whether or not we'd be counting citizenship. But another one, which I'll show a slide that we know also exists, is item non-response. And this is one in which a household responds to the census, but in this particular case, they may not reveal every person who lives at that house. And as an instance of this, I myself was not counted in the 2000 census. I was renting a room in a single family housing unit. It was in a place, Goleta, California, outside of UCSB, that wasn't zoned for single family, that wasn't zoned for renting. And so the landlord who was renting the room was concerned that if they revealed that they were renting out the house, that somehow they'd get in trouble. And I couldn't dissuade them from that. But the point is, and I've also actually had the luxury of walking along with census canvassers, and there are people living in situations with kind of overcrowding situations where we know that they're not revealing everyone who lives in the house. The demographic analysis also was mentioned by Mark 5 talks ago. But here, the chart here shows from the 2010 census, the net undercounts and overcounts by age group. And we've seen this for many decades in that we know that the census is missing, especially children between the ages of 0 to 4. We see them suddenly show up, miraculously, at the age of 10 years later. But they're missing when they're children. And they obviously have to be there. And so the parents are counted, but the kids are not. And so we know that we have this long-standing issue with item non-response in the census. And we know some of the characteristics of these people. They tend to be living in poverty, adults without a high school diploma, immigrants, renter-occupied housing units, etc. So we know some things, we know these people exist. These item non-responses, we know that they exist. We know some things about their characteristics, but surprisingly, we know relatively little about why people choose not to enumerate everyone who lives in their house. And so I think we should ask how this might come into play with COVID. We're in the midst of a housing crisis, and so there's been a lot of news, for example, about the eviction epidemic. And maybe that's not as bad as it could have been, because we had, at least in the United States, we had an eviction moratorium, although it varied by states in terms of how long it lasted. But even with the eviction moratorium, on the right, we see some statistics from the real estate industry showing that there was a significant rise in vacancy rates for multifamily units during the second quarter of 2020. And so there's a lot of evidence showing that the housing market, housing units, especially the low ends of housing units, there was a lot of crisis going along and a lot of churning. And the question is where are these households going? Even if they're not being evicted, where are they going? We have also seen in the press, a lot of reports about kind of non-standard housing situations. So one that has always been a challenge is the situation of doubling up, in which you have multiple families, maybe multi-generations, but multiple families deciding to live together. Couch surfing is an example of doubling up. But it's a common strategy in which households who are kind of marginalized in the housing market deal with crisis. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, at least, that it's been one strategy that households have been using to manage the housing crisis during the pandemic. I've also seen other data, some from the Census poll survey, but from other places as well, suggesting that more and more people are living in vehicles. And if someone has been living in their vehicle for a while, they're probably known to the homeless system. There are places where people can stay. But for people that are kind of newly homeless, chances are higher that we're not going to know where they are, and we're not going to know where to count them. And so there's point here is that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's families dealing with housing crisis in various ways. And these happen to be ways that we know that the census has historically not done well with. The census does fantastic with, sorry, some family issues going on. The census does fantastic with owners. We do less well with counting renters. We do less well with the long-term homeless, but we've made a lot of progress in counting the long-term homeless over the last few decades. But here we're talking about families that are very much in transition, living in cars in places where they might not be, doubling up, living in situations where maybe their hosts aren't legally allowed to rent, as the case that I found myself in 2000. And so we saw a lot of this, for example, after Katrina. And the point is that we do not have data systems in place to assess really the population and specific housing impacts of disasters in the US. And it's especially problematic for people that are living at the margins of the housing market. The estimates of the number of people living doubling up, for example, is much, much larger than the number of people who we traditionally think of as homeless and perhaps living in streets or in shelters or in campgrounds. And these are basically, in my opinion, a black hole in terms of data and our knowledge about how people deal with housing crises. And so obviously, COVID-19 came at the worst possible time for the US Census. But moreover, the way in which COVID-19 has impacted housing, particularly at the kind of who are already marginalized in the housing market, these are the exact types of situations in which our data system does not currently detect. And so a lot of this is speculative, but I want to close really with a call that researchers, both in and out of the census, but we need to pay much more attention to the strategies that marginalized Americans are using to house themselves during disasters, during hurricanes, fires, and pandemic. There's a lot of unusual housing situations, and these, one, we have trouble counting them in the census, but two, kind of as scientists, we know relatively little about what's how houses make these decisions and how they cope with crisis. And so, when I came to this because, well, not just Dave, but a lot of people have been asking me, since I think a lot about census data quality, how will COVID affect the census? And, there's a lot of things that we can't definitively answer. And I think the fact that we can't definitively answer these questions shows at least a failing by us as researchers, and that we need to be asking some rather important questions about housing and about housing crisis in the United States, and I presume Canada as well. I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you, Nick. I think we have gotten out on the table plenty of questions. And luckily, we have an audience here who are going to provide the answers, we hope, or add to the pile of questions. So the procedure is going to be here. If you've got something to say, and please don't be shy, raise your hand. Use the little button down at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand. And Jaywan is going to be monitoring that, and we'll be calling on people in the order that you raise your hand. And so please unmute your microphone when you are recognized, and feel free to chip in and ask questions, answer questions, raise new issues, respond to things that our panel has gotten out there.
Kingsley, you're the first one asking questions.
I guess a couple of things. One is this work that Mark Perry was discussing about enumeration versus estimation. How good has that been in the past? And in general, what's the pressure of that? In other words, one of the things I've seen is that back in many years ago, in the 60s and 70s in Texas, the undercount in the Texas-Mexico border area was very high.
Mm-hmm.
And it took almost 7 or 8 years for us to figure out how big it was, and then to make an argument to the census and to the local community of how they ought to rectify it in order to try to get funding and other things that all went on a per capita basis from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to do that politically now, or is this cut off?
Okay, so you're not asking about the demographic analysis numbers. You're asking about sort of the.
Well, I'm asking this demographic first because the undercount is demographic. Okay.
Sure.
Census, in fact, undercounted Cameron County, Hidalgo County. All these. I mean, significantly, not just. Gee whiz, we're off by 2 or 3%. We're off by probably 12, 14%. And that meant a lot for those communities in terms of what they needed in terms of social services and other things. And so trying to get that corrected is all I'm saying. What's the problem?
So
I mean, the census agreed with what the numbers were wrong, but
So I can tell you there is discussion going on inside the Census Bureau now about maybe rethinking some of the, it's what we call a CQR count question resolution, which is essentially like the complaint desk after the census goes out. And it's a fairly, at least traditionally over the last couple of censuses, it's been very limited. So it's really, if you go and say, hey, Census Bureau, you missed this area, that's not actually within bounds. It's a very limited scope of kind of, if things were misallocated spatially, that's within bounds. If a prison was put in a wrong neighborhood, that was within bounds. But I mean, but it was, very limited. And so there has at least been discussion that because of COVID, people are going to, people have concerns, and they have more concerns than in past censuses about the quality of the census data. And, I'll be candid with you, the longer it takes for us to get those first numbers out,
Sure,
the more anxiety people have. It's kind of like if we had put the numbers out in December, people would have been anxious that we were rushing it. If we put them out a year from now, they'll be anxious that we took too long. So in theory, there is some like sweet spot in the middle somewhere where we took enough time but not too much. And I sort of hope that April is that sweet spot where we are we're taking all of the time that we traditionally did, and we are doing extra processing of the census this time. I can't really get into kind of the details of it, but I can tell you we took a much earlier and much more expansive look at the numbers than we ever did before. Because even internally in the Census Bureau, we were very, very concerned, like, what are these numbers going to look like? Is this a credible census?
I've got one other question, and that really relates to Mark and the Canadian census. And what kind of differences do you see in certain distributions of people moving from urban or semi-urban areas to less urban areas in Ontario versus Quebec? Have you looked at that?
I haven't looked at that, Kingsley. So, hopefully some of the demographic numbers coming will give us a take on it, but I haven't seen those numbers, to be frank.
I mean, it just seems to me that although Montreal is very dominant in Quebec, I mean, Sherbrooke and the smaller towns seems like they're quite a draw if in fact you're moving out and stepping down. I mean, everybody wants to look at Ontario for that, but Quebec kind of fits a pattern that way that could be very attractive for me to move out of Quebec City or Montreal to Sherbrooke or some other town that's one step down or two steps down, but still has lots of urban amenities in some ways.
I could definitely see that. I mean, there's places like the Eastern Townships, which Sherbrooke is kind of part of, which are very attractive places to live in Quebec. And there's also parts north of Montreal around Mont Tremblant and the ski hills up there, and the small quaint towns, which would be very, very popular places to go. So I would surmise that there's a lot of interest in moving, or in fact, people are moving to those areas.
I'd just add, I think there's, the anecdotal evidence that that's happening. It's moving out of Montreal, it's moving out of Vancouver and into some of those outlying areas. It's a scale of the flows we don't have a good handle on, but certainly some of the residential or real estate data I'm thinking of indicates some of that movement occurring.
Okay, so now we have a question from Ife, please.
Oh yeah, it's me. Thank you very much for getting me here. And here I see my advisor, P, is here. Really glad to know him. He's on the panel from the east to the west. I thought it was a West Pacific event, but actually it's a global event. I'm very glad to see you. Happy New Year to you. So I have a question, because I've been working on the high-tech industry, particularly interested. I'm looking at what's the implication of the pandemic and on the high-tech industry, innovation centers. And from what I see, just as many of you mentioned, and people are moving away from big cities to suburban areas. Also, the counter-urbanization, those small communities become more appealing and in terms of young generation, particularly for the talents, the big T there. You might particularly concern now, and on top of that is we have some bright stars so far. Austin, for example, North Carolina. But Austin become a concern for me. And of course, LA has some concern as well. But Austin right now, they got the whole Texas, the storm, snowstorm, the power grid, everything's shut down. I just want to seek your opinion, given the pandemic, given the institutional environment, what's going on right now in this country, and what's the prospect for Silicon Valley? What's the prospect for Boston? What's the prospect for North Carolina and Austin, those cities alike, and what's their future? And because without those big Mac innovation centers, I think it has serious implications for this country in terms of global competitiveness, in terms of technology, and then many other aspects. And then we're talking about how to ramp up to the innovation against China, whatever you call China, the competitor or enemy or whatever you call it. But we need to work from within this country, how we can do, not just to blame China or point the fingers, but then right now the pandemic and also the partisan fights and everything goes on. I want to seek your opinion on this. What's the future for those potential stars, and what's the future for the current and the big stars, right? Bright stars and emerging stars. So your opinion, please.
Can I jump in there? Yeah, I guess, my first comment would be, let's not underestimate the need and the importance of face-to-face interaction that we will only get in large cities and with that daily interaction. One of the things that I miss is just being in the office in the casual corridor conversations or at a coffee session at WRSA, post-session where we can talk about things. And the same thing happens, of course, in industry, in business. And so we're going to need that. And while we might see more remote working and teleworking, it may be a different model yet where people spend part of the week remote, part of the week at the office and engaged, in those major centers. So I don't think we're not abandoning this idea of in-person daily work. We're going to a new model, I think, is what's going to happen. And I know that doesn't speak to a Boston or other high-tech type centers, but I think we sort of need to keep that in mind, that it's not, there's a shift, yes, but not a full shift to only doing remote work.
To add to that, I think it's absolutely right. We're going to have a new model, and I think people are going to go back to cities. People always go back after a crisis. We always go back to flood zones. We're going to go back to cities too.
We have short memories. Basically, human beings have short memories. We're going to forget about the pandemic, sure. But that's very unfortunate to some extent. If we forget this thing, that's going to be really something huge for the human being in the future. We cannot forget this thing forever, not in my lifetime at least, over my dead body maybe. Put it in that way, and never going to forget the pandemic thing. The whole year is a mess, complete disaster, unprecedented history. Yeah.
Though, the last great shock was the Great Recession. And the net result of that was the growth of the big cities and the increased interest in people being more physically together and enjoying conviviality and everything. I think, once things get safe, there's going to be a pent-up demand for those kinds of activities also. So it's by no means clear. The tendency always with trends is that people think whatever the current trend is will just continue and worsen or be exacerbated. And the reality is that things swing back and forth. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in a regional science sense in the post-pandemic world or the continuing COVID world, which might be, you know, some variant of what we're currently dealing with, but on a much lesser scale, hopefully.
That reminds me, P, you know, when I took the population geography back in Buffalo, I still keep those words in and talk about urbanization. It's about life cycle style. And when you mow and over, when you grow older, at different stage of lives, and you have different preference for location in terms of living, in terms of working. So here I'm trying to make a connection, for example. Younger generations, for people like in the 20s, they want to go back to, like students, say, we want to go back to classroom. We don't care whatever the pandemic. We want to go to have my social life, campus life back. But people like me in the 50s, or in the 50s, started, hey, wait a second, you guys can have it. I cannot stand it. So maybe there's an age thing, the life stage where you have family, you're single, move to family life, have kids, and then we're in the middle empty nest, and then go to retirement. We have different preference in terms of choice of living, what is desirable, what is most appealing to us. So putting back into the economy, and most people think the younger generations are the driving forces, particularly the young talent, college graduates. Those are the most bright stars. They create most creative ideas. So could this have implication for different places, big cities, small, and coastal versus like Austin, those cities? I'm just right in the middle of now writing a proposal. I'm seeking some advice from you to help me set up this thing.
Okay, any other question? If not, can I ask one question to Bruce? And it might be the question to both of you, Bruce and Mark. One of the slides in your presentation, Bruce, you showed the different direction of the immigration to Canada during the quarter one through quarter four of this year. The last year, 2020. Interestingly, back in 2019, for three different types of immigration to Canada, economic reasons, family, and refugee, it moved together, it grew together. But in the pandemic, it showed the opposite direction because, you know, overall, the economic reason immigration to Canada decreased significantly, while the other two types of migration, family-related and the refugee, increased, even though it is a slight increase. And I was able to connect some with Mark's graph showing this huge drop by metros in Canada for the immigration. So do you have any possible explanation? And I mean, I can think of some of those families. I mean, you have a huge Chinese immigrant population in big metros in Canada, and did they attract more expensive family members from China, or any other possible explanation?
It's a good question, and I'm not really sure what's going on. I too was sort of struck by that you know, two of the three groups increased over the third and fourth quarter. Economic immigrants continued to decline because there wasn't a huge shift in terms of government policy for or around immigration. So I'm not sure if it was maybe a process. It was might have just reflected a processing thing, that some, you know, the family class and the refugee humanitarian group or sponsored group, their processing might have already been in place, whereas economic arrivals might have been working on a shorter or more just-in-time processing. And that's what was with the shutdown in visa offices, that's what really got hit, at least short term. I'm guessing there at best, though.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question from Kingsley.
One of the issues raised by Bruce is that, like it or not, Canada gets just the way you get housing beside each other, you get a good house beside another, you get a negative spillover. The US consequences might have been a negative spillover on the Canadian flows, simply because of the region that they're in. Not because Canada was doing anything different, but because the US was in this funk of, not letting any decent people into the country. I mean, it was really awful. But the consequence is that it kind of spills over in countries that are nearby. And this is obviously a neighbor that gets spilled over in a very negative way. And even though Canada was very open and had powerful policies trying to fix it, you still get this negative spillover. I mean, it's one of those spatial components that people don't want to look at that's high, that level of scale, but it's true.
And
something here?
eBay, yeah.
I think there is a something bigger than that. Because we know the political atmosphere is toxic. It has been toxic during the last few years during Trump's administration. And many of my colleagues here in California, I don't know anybody else, okay? They're talking about, we're moving out of California. We're moving out of the United States altogether to Canada, other more open countries. That's one. Second, talking about the Asian immigrants. Now, there's something going back. We call it returnees, because the so anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment has been so strong in this country. And plus, Canada does not do a better job. So they're engaging the geopolitical fights, which lead to many Asian, including Chinese, are considering moving back to China, return. You like it or not, it's a communist country, it's a dictatorship, but it's something called a home. Yeah. That sentiment hurts a lot among Asian communities. Sure. I want to tell you the truth, nothing but the truth.
Absolutely.
That's what my 2 cents added to the conversation.
Okay, any other question? If not, I don't know. Do we have time for one more question, Dave? Because I'm kind of benefiting to ask one last question, if it is okay.
If not, I'll ask.
Actually, I was going to say something to Nicholas about your presentation, which I thought all of your comments about kind of what the Census Bureau does well or doesn't do so well enumeration-wise, your comments are spot on. I'll broaden it a little bit though and say, I mean, my concern and the concern of some of the demographers at the Census Bureau this past year about the pandemic was partly that the people we tend to undercount, we would undercount more of, and the people we overcount, we would overcount more of. And the overcount often kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And I don't know why personally, I think people should focus on it as much as on the undercount, but both of those were concerns of people at Census. So we did modify some of our operations this year to address both of them. And I can't really say more than that, but because, you know, you think about it, I mean, just the way that the population shuffled, and essentially it was like, oh my gosh, we have you know, and this was the first time we had the internet self-response. So, I mean, that alone, even without the pandemic, we were anticipating we were anticipating much more of an overcount this time, and duplication that we would have to address. And then the pandemic just added, you know, fuel to that fire.
Yeah, kind of related question to Nick that I had was, it is quite interesting here in Southern Nevada and what is happening between LA County and Clark County, which is home for Las Vegas Metro. always this massive flow from Las Vegas County to Clark County is one of the top ranked county to county flows. And what happened, yes, pandemic and COVID-19 in LA County is serious, more serious than Clark County. But we still have a lot of issues with the COVID-19 in Clark County as well. But all those recent, massive flow because of the rising, minimum wage in Clark County and housing affordability issues rising minimum wage in LA County and housing affordability issues in LA County. That kind of, the recent pandemic even triggered more massive flow. And then we are experiencing here in Clark County, the housing price increase, unlike many other metros, big metros, we have 2.3 million of population. For the last year or so, the average housing price appreciation is double digit. We are one of the few cases. And actually that is linked not only to this pandemic, but the recent pattern, and it creates a lot of problem in our rental housing market. For those, the locals who could not afford with this the rapidly rising housing costs, they become a transient, the homeless, and it creates all sorts of problems. I just wanted to share this type of anecdotal evidence of what we observe here, and then we are talking a lot with the state and local government, how to deal with this rising affordability. That's nothing compared to LA County, but still it creates all sorts of problems for the locals, especially with the economic downturns we're experiencing for the resort industry and then leisure and hospitality, those who lost their jobs.
Sure.
Good. I think we should wrap things up here. I think we should thank the panel, maybe with a round of applause.